So, when we think about home, we think about the, coming home for Christmas and, the fire and the warm hearth. We think about baseball, the home run and home plate. But, for astronomers, I think what we think about, what we tend to think about, is something else. And what we think about is our home galaxy, the Milky Way. And so that's what this talk is about. Of course, with the unaided eye, we really can't see much, if any, color in the Milky Way. And I got to say that and this is a realization I came to some decades ago. This is where in the old days, photographic film and now the camera sensor can actually depict reality way better than the human eye can actually see it. Because there are colors there, and we know this. But the human eye, because of the physiography of it, and I'm not going to go into all of that, can't detect color at low light levels, and so the color that is there is tantalizingly beyond our ability to see it with the human eye. There's some astronomical objects, of course, where we can see that. We see, for example, for the bright planets, we know that Mars is a distinct ochre color, especially right now when it's almost overhead. Due north of Orion, we see that Saturn is slightly yellow. We see that Antares is quite orange, and of course, at a total solar eclipse, we see the shocking pink of the prominences on the edge of the sun, and we can see those colors, and those are true colors. We can see them only because those objects are bright and bright enough to trigger the cones in our eyes, which are the receptors that show color. But with the Milky Way, for example, it's a beautiful, lovely to the unaided eye, a beautiful gossamer band across the sky, especially in the northern hemisphere summer, but we can't really see the color. And so when the astrophotographer turns the camera lens on, we see something more like that. And so we now see the glowing red ionized hydrogen gas clouds, the yellow of the sort of yellow-orange of the stars toward the center of the Milky Way off the right side. And this is one of the reasons why I'm an astrophotographer. I'm an observational astronomer, but I love astrophotography because it opens the door to what I'm going to call sort of the true colors of our universe. And so I call this talk "There's No Place Like Home," borrowing, shamelessly from a movie from more than half a century ago. And so this is an astrophotographic tour of our Milky Way galaxy. And many of you will have seen way better photographs than mine. These are all mine, and I hope that you won't think that they're too terrible. I think that I'm a reasonably competent astrophotographer, but I know that there are many others in the society who are much more accomplished than I am. One of the advantages that many of them have is that they have permanent observatories, and I don't, and I never have. And so what I'll tell you is that all of the astrophotos that you're going to see were made in one of two places, either Algonquin Park, Provincial Park in Ontario. This is my setup there, or in the outback of Australia. And here I am near Karajuta and Uluru, Ayers Rock. I've got an observing site just outside there in the red outback of Australia, and all of these photos were done in those places using these instruments that you can see here, as well as wide angle. I'm very fond of wide angle. I really like that, and obviously the photo that you just saw of the Milky Way was wide angle, shot with a 24mm lens. I love wide angle. It gives just such a beautiful view of so many objects all in one frame. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves what the Milky Way would look like if we could look at it from afar, go way out and turn back and look at it. Well, how do we do that, or how do we sort of replicate that in any way that means something to us? Well, I'm going to show you something that, of course, is familiar to every amateur astronomer of every level of experience. And of course, that is M31, the Andromeda Galaxy. And so when we think about the Andromeda Galaxy, what we see is a part of the local group, 2.5 million light years away. It's about 50% larger than our Milky Way galaxy. And what's really interesting is if you look at it, obviously, it's almost edge on, but it's actually inclined about 12.5 degrees to our line of sight, 12.5 degrees. However, if you were to go out to M31 and turn back and look at our Milky Way galaxy from the same distance, first of all, you'd see it only about 2/3 the size. But second, you would see our Milky Way galaxy not inclined at 12.5 degrees, but inclined rather at 21.5 degrees, a greater inclination. So it would be more open, and it might very well be that the dust lanes would not be as prominent, but you would see it much more open, which I think is kind of an interesting thing sort of to think about. And so, that's what our Milky Way approximately would look like if we went all of that distance out. Now, so we start here, and I'm going to start with the northern Milky Way and what we can see, obviously, from our latitudes. And I'm going to show you later on toward the end of this little talk, the southern Milky Way, what we can't see from here and what is seen to great effect from the southern hemisphere. And so here, this is the northern Milky Way, and this is a 14-millimeter lens, super wide angle. And I'm actually going to ask, Bruce, if you can just unmute yourself for a moment, can you just tell me whether you can see my cursor moving there, or maybe just do a thumbs up or something? Okay, great. Okay, great. So everybody can see that. And so what we have here is the constellation over on the left side of Cepheus. And then we move through Cygnus, where my cursor is now. Down, we see Altair in Aquila, Scutum, and then tantalizing over here down toward the lower right, toward the center of our Milky Way galaxy. So this is a super wide angle view. But I'm going to start up here. So let's see what we can see there. And we're going to start in Perseus and Cassiopeia. And of course, we're all very familiar with both of those constellations. Perseus, if for no other reason, then it has the double cluster, H and Chi Persei, the two open clusters side by side. And Cassiopeia, very prominent W figure there. And what I do, for those of you who have seen my photos on my Flickr page, is I fairly painstakingly do two versions of all of my photos. One just like this, and then a second one with constellation boundaries, star patterns, and labels. And so it won't necessarily, this is shot from Algonquin Park, it won't necessarily be obvious to you exactly what you're seeing here. But if I go to the next one, you will then see here the familiar W of Cassiopeia. You'll see Perseus over here, Andromeda down here. And then what we see is all of these deep sky objects. The ones in red are hydrogen alpha, ionized hydrogen gas, and those really are the true colors that they emit, even though you can't see them, as I say, with the naked eye. And then all of these ones in green are open star clusters. And so we see M103 over here. This is actually one of the few actually Messier open clusters in this area. This is just a sensationally beautiful and captivating area of the sky because there's so many objects. And I'm just going to go back then. So many objects to see observationally and photographically, as you can see. I love this area, and it's very well placed for observing in the fall. Okay, so we go forward here, and here then is a photo of the double cluster H and Chi Persei. It is right in the Milky Way, and you can see how star rich This is just, two beautiful bejeweled clusters in the night sky. Nearby, we have the California Nebula. Not surprisingly, because of the shape. That was discovered in 1884 by the famed American astronomer E. Barnard, who did a lot of work, particularly with dark gas clouds, which I'm going to talk about just a little bit later. It's about 1,000 light years distant, and it's a really nice object to photograph. Fairly difficult to see naked eye, no doubt about that. And then we go in a little closer to Cassiopeia. Let me just go here so you can sort of pick out. We see the W of Cassiopeia, and so we're moving in just a little bit closer, and we see down here the double cluster just over the boundary into Perseus, and again numerous open clusters of stars and a lot of ionized hydrogen gas glowing red. So this is a really terrific area of the sky, and it's particularly well suited for observation in the fall. Sorry, if I can just go back. Let me just go back. Where are we here? Yeah, 3. So what I'm going to do now is show you some close-ups. Here, this photograph, by the way, is with a 200 millimeter lens, okay? Probably set at, I think, about 135 millimeters. I'm going to show you these two objects, the so-called Heart and Soul nebulae, which are fairly well known. If I can just go forward here. So this is the Soul Nebula in Cassiopeia, and this is shot with a my favorite photographic telescope, which is a Teleview 127 millimeter f5.2 telescope. It's really almost an astrograph, and one of the advantages of a scope like this is that you can see even right to the edge that these stars are really pinpoints. Now, and I'm going to say one other thing here that I think may surprise you a little bit. Every photograph you see here is a number of stacked frames, but the frames are only 1 minute long. 1 minute. And so all of these are somewhere between 10 and 20 stacked frames for total exposure times of between 10 and 20 minutes. And I use generally for my astrophotos, a Nikon D810A, the A being the astrophotographic version of the camera. So I just, people are always interested in that, and I thought I would sort of let you know right off the bat. It is quite amazing what you can actually do with fairly short exposures, which I need because I've got to set up my equipment. I got to take it up in the car. I have to set it up every night in Algonquin Park. It takes me about 40 minutes from when I arrive until I'm ready to go, and then take it all down again, several hours later, put it back in the car, and then go wherever I'm going to go. Our family cottage is about 60 kilometers from there, or sometimes just drive right back to Toronto, which is about 2.5 hours away. And so, I can't afford to do what other astronomers with observatories can do, have one object and they're going to shoot for 8 hours, with autogliders while they're, inside watching TV or something. I can't do that. It's a little more challenging for me. Then we get to the Heart Nebula right beside it, and I love this because you can see the ventricles and the various parts of the heart here, and I think that it's really well described. The Heart Nebula is really one of it's a tricky one to photograph, but I really like this an awful lot. And this was shot in 2017 with a 540 millimeter, again a Teleview one, but just a slightly smaller, well, 4-inch diameter telescope. So that's Cassiopeia. And then and so here, one of the things that we see and we know about these gas clouds, which are often star nurseries, is that they often surround open clusters of stars, and we can see this. So, for example, the large one here, right in the center, Malot 15, also called Colander 26, and then here we see a small one distant, a Tombo. Well, that name is fairly familiar to astronomers, and so these open clusters of stars are fairly young as compared with globular clusters that are billions of years old and have stayed gravitationally tightly together for all of that time. Open clusters of stars that are recognizable as open clusters are gravitationally bound together, but very loosely. And as a result, they drift away fairly quickly and then become unrecognizable, and you don't call them star clusters anymore, which is why they are made up of young stars, and they tend to be gone after somewhere between, say, 1 and 10 million years. But we do see an awful lot of these open clusters of stars in the hydrogen gas clouds. So then we go to another really nice constellation, Auriga. Sometimes people say Auriga. You may not be able to pick it out necessarily here. This is a fairly short exposure. This is going back actually now several years, but you will be familiar with the star pattern here, and in particular the first magnitude star Capella in Auriga. It's also a fall constellation, and one of the reasons I like this constellation is the three fairly prominent and bright Messier open clusters, M37, 36, and 38. And then down here, lower left, well, actually sort of, no, over here, sorry, is M35 in Gemini. It's not included in this, it's off to the left. But those four star clusters in the Messier, all in the Messier catalog, are a real treat to view telescopically. So I really like this a lot. And then zooming in on these, we can see, and here, this is a 200 millimeter lens view of all three of these, and you can see they have very different characteristics. They're different sizes, different shapes, different magnitudes. They're all approximately the same distance away, between 4,000 and 4,500 light years from us. But the ages are also different as well. You can see, for example, that M36 is fairly young, and for open clusters, M37 and M38 are really a lot older. Not really approaching globular cluster age, but still, fairly old. So I really do like these. And then when we get in even closer, these are views with my Explorer scientific 152 millimeter or 6-inch diameter telescope. That was the long black tube that you saw in one of the early photographs. So these are all right embedded in the Milky Way. Here's M35, and one of the things that, and this is in Gemini, one of the things that you often see, this is M35 here itself, is that there are lots of open clusters nearby, and so people look at M35, they don't really look at what's beside it. And so this little one, Malot 40, is just jammed. It's really stardust. Not all that bright, but even in an 80 millimeter telescope with a decent eyepiece, you can get a really nice view of this stardust littering the sky. And in this little area, of course, we have some well-known objects, some of them part of the Milky Way. This one, of course, we all know as M45, the Pleiades, that was actually sitting fairly close to the eclipsed moon this past Monday night. The Rosette Nebula in Monoceros. I find this a tricky one to photograph. One of the reasons is that it's a winter object, Monoceros being fairly near Orion, and as a result, it's cold whenever you get to photograph it here in the Northern Hemisphere. All of this is going to be familiar to you as well. 200 millimeter lens. I really do like this. This is the best one I've been able to get so far. I find this tricky, the Horsehead and the Zeta Orionis Nebula. And then finally, of course, M42. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I just thought I would bring those up. We're now moving down. We start up, we were looking at Auriga and Perseus and then Cassiopeia. And then we're now moving down to Cepheus, which is between Cassiopeia and Cygnus. And so we're going to get into the well-known part of the summer Milky Way. But Cepheus is really interesting. And here we have Cassiopeia up here, and obviously the North American Nebula, which we'll be seeing shortly, in Cygnus. And Cepheus is this area here, and in particular, and this is just a wonderful hydrogen gas cloud. It goes by the extremely sexy name of of IC, which means index catalog, IC 1396. And one of the things you see here is that there are a lot of dark nebulae. And of course, we know that when we look at the Milky Way, we see that it is sort of riven by a dark lane in between. Well, that's not an absence of stars. That is indeed dark lane, at foreground, dark cold gas that obscures the light from beyond, and that's that sort of bifurcation into two of the Milky Way in Cygnus and then running down through Scutum, which we'll see. And this particular one is a very large area over here on the right called Le Gentil, number 3, dark nebula, and there are various others. The B names here always meaning Barnard, because he was the great American cataloger of all of these dark nebulae. And here we start to see then, again, we see a lot of hydrogen gas clouds and open clusters. And then, so I'm going to zero in now on IC 1396. This is one of my favorites. It's actually fairly large, and so it's a little tricky sometimes actually to get it into one, into the sort of one frame. What I want to mention here is well, I guess actually are two things. First of all, we see, and let me just see whether I've got this. Yes, you can see down here, and you've seen professional telescope views of this, the so-called elephant trunk nebula within this gas cloud. This is really as close as I can get to get a good view of it. But the other thing I want to mention, apart from the various dark globules of gas here that you see strewn throughout, is this so-called Herschel's garnet star, also Mu Cephei. And this is a really interesting star. It is about an actual brightness 100,000 times as bright as our sun. It has approximately 1,000 times the sun's radius. And so if it were our sun instead, the edge of the limb of that sun, it would engulf the orbit all the way out to the orbit of Jupiter. That is the size. It's about really not actually all that well known, but about 3,000 to 5,000 light years away. And you can see that it really shines with an ochre light. And so, Herschel thought that it looked very garnet in color, which I think I really agree with. Okay, so let's now then move to the summer triangle. And everybody is familiar with this. I think, Bruce, I'm probably going to have to cut this talk a little bit short because I'm only about halfway through. And what I might do is I might skip some stuff and then go, because I want to show some stuff from the southern hemisphere. So this is very familiar to us, the summer triangle. And I should say that this name, the summer triangle, was actually popularized only in the 1950s. First of all, by the great astronomer popularizer in England, Patrick Moore, who had the longest running BBC show on astronomy, longest running BBC show, and it happened to be on astronomy. I met him. I have a photograph of him beside my telescope in Java in 1983 when we went to see the great long 6-minute 30-second solar eclipse. And so we have, of course, here then the 3 stars, Vega, Deneb, and Altair. Vega was the first star that I ever looked at through my first telescope in May of 1970. When I got my telescope and joined the RASC, so it's got sort of a special place in my heart. And then the familiar star pattern of Cygnus and the Northern Cross. And of course, you've all heard probably, well, I assume you probably have, of the Southern Cross, and you're going to see a picture of that later. And so what we have here, we got the North American Nebula here, and then the Gamma Cygni field, which I'm going to show some pictures of. I'm not going to go through all of these these. But we see then this is a 50 millimeter view, a little closer in, and we see, what I was talking about, the dark lane of gas through here that sort of divides the Milky Way kind of in two, and it really comes through here in this photograph. All of these are shot from Algonquin Park in Ontario. Lots of deep sky objects. Obviously down here we see the Veil Nebula. So that shows you where it is, and here around the bright star, this is Gamma Cygni, right in the middle of Cygnus and the summer Milky Way, and all of the intricate gas clouds around Satyr or Gamma Cygni, and here is the galactic equator. So this is, if you were to put a sort of an axis through the rotation plane of the Milky Way, this is where it would be. Right, and there's what I think is a somewhat better shot of these hydrogen gas clouds. I really like this area of the sky an awful lot. And then going forward, we have just a little further away the Crescent Nebula, which I find difficult to photograph with my equipment. This is the best one I've ever been able to get. And I don't think it's that great, but it does show it. But then we get to some of our favorites. The North American Nebula here, named obviously because of its shape, and then the adjacent Pelican Nebula. And it actually isn't adjacent, it's all part of the same system, but there is foreground dark gas here that makes it look as though they are separated. This one is shot again with a 200 millimeter lens. This is the bright star Deneb, which we're all familiar with, first magnitude star. And then when we get a little bit closer, actually with the telescope, okay, these are just the labels. This is what we see. And we really do see here, and I think that this is worthwhile noting, that stars do have different colors. Except for the bright ones, you can't see them with the unaided eye. But the photographic film and the photographic sensor definitely show them, as long as the exposures aren't too long, so they get burned in white, whatever their original colors actually are. And so we can really see there's a real difference here between the blue here and the ochre. Well, it actually looks like Herschel's Garnet Star, but this is just outside the North American Nebula. And you can see there's an awful lot of detail in here. I just love this area of the sky. And of course, the North American Nebula in a dark sky, you actually can see the outlines of with the unaided eye, and it's very obvious in binoculars. All right, and then sort of this is again a closer view with IC 1386, and there you see Herschel's Garnet Star. And I always like showing these things wider angles so you can see where they are in relation to each other and how far apart. Okay, and then the Veil or the Cirrus Nebula, as it's known, very well-known object, obviously. This is the visible part of the Great Cygnus Loop, which is a supernova remnant about 2,400 light years away, and a real radio and X-ray source as well. And as part of it, right up here, we see what's called Pickering's triangle. I find this a real challenge to photograph. But one of the things I find interesting about this is that you see both blue and pink red light. Blue being the reflection nebula, and reflected light, which is what you get in the Trifid Nebula, and then the red being an emission nebula, that is ionized gas that's excited to glow in red. Then we move down, so we'll leave Cygnus, and now what we're going to do is we're going to move down, almost left Cygnus, into the constellation of Aquila, getting closer to the center. And this then is Altair, and one of the things I really like about this is a more recent photograph, I think last year. What we see here is what's often called a triple E nebula. Dark nebula, sort of with the looking like a letter E. I really like photographing dark nebula. I just think that they're absolutely fascinating, and these nebula I think are some of my some of my favorites. And so we then get to Vulpecula and what is called Brocchi's cluster, or sometimes the coat hanger. This was, I think, earlier this year that I photographed this one, I think in the spring, and we can see this quite well. It's very familiar to people. You can see it in a dark sky, naked eye. In binoculars, it's very obvious. And what I really like and what's often overlooked is this, again, this sort of stardust NGC open cluster right beside it. And of course, the Dumbbell Nebula. I really like this one as well, sometimes called the apple core, photographed with a large telescope. And this is really close in. It's a, and so you don't see sort of, it's fairly a star-rich area because it is, right in the Milky Way, but you don't get quite that impression, of, the beauty of the Milky Way when you're shooting so close in on these objects. So let's then move into Scutum, which is a small constellation, and we're now getting closer to Ophiuchus and Sagittarius. And this is where we really start to get the bright northern Milky Way. We're also getting closer to the horizon as seen from the north, but these photographs are all from the northern hemisphere, and we really see then the bifurcation, the division into two of the northern Milky Way. It's really prominent in Scutum, and we see here Altair, and so Aquila is over here, and it'll just go here. We see Scutum is a very small constellation. Aquila is fairly large, and then Serpens over here. And now we're going to look in on Scutum a little closer. And we see here M11, one of my favorites, the so-called wild duck open cluster, which I look at and try and photograph all the time. Former RASC president Randy Atwood always kids me because he knows every time I'm out there, I'm going to be shooting M11. And I'm going to show a closer view. This was this was a year and a bit ago, M11, showing the incredibly rich star field that surrounds this object. It really is quite stunning when we take a look at it, and it's beautiful to see through even a modest sized telescope. And again, with many of the dark nebulae that you see here. Okay, so let's then get into what we really are interested in, and that is the center of the Milky Way Galaxy. And you're going to start to see now some photographs from the southern hemisphere. And so this one is the center of the Milky Way, shot with a 24mm lens. This is shot from the center of Australia. This is a view you cannot see from the northern hemisphere. And when I photographed this in September 2019, it was right overhead. And I got to tell you, and I say this all the time whenever I do presentations like this, every northern hemisphere astronomer wants to get into the southern hemisphere at least once in her or his lifetime during new moon when the sky is clear, because you will then see what it's all about. And the thinking is that if the telescope had been invented, and if European astronomers had actually lived in the southern hemisphere, so they could see this bulge, and then it sort of dwindles off to both sides, it would have been obvious a century earlier that this is a galaxy similar to all the galaxies we see elsewhere, and you wouldn't have had all of the great controversy, right up into the early 1900s as to what the Milky Way was and how close it was and all of that. And you really see this. And I got to say, when I first saw it in 1983 from Papua New Guinea, it's almost frighteningly bright, and it seems close. It's a very interesting psychological effect. So this is the center of the galaxy, and some of these objects are going to be very familiar to the Lagoon Nebula here, and of course, we see the Eagle Nebula and so on. I'm going to show closer views of those, and then from about here down, that's all hidden from us by the bulge of the Earth. And so here we see, and it's really hard to pick out, we see the tail of the scorpion, with M7 right in here, the great, very large, bright open cluster that's just above the horizon. We see the teapot of Sagittarius, and this is the center of the galaxy. So that's where it is. And if you're looking at the teapot, in the summer sky, next summer, not now, it's gone, but that's where it is. And you can just imagine that that's the center of our Milky Way galaxy. All right, and so here is a closer view, and what I find is amazing is this area here. It actually looks like brain. The detail is incredible, and you can't photograph that from here. You just can't. It's too low in the sky. But from Australia, you can really get that. And here we see again in very close. We see the teapot of Sagittarius here in the galactic center, which is right in Sagittarius. So one of the great globular clusters in the sky, actually the second brightest after 47 Tucanae, is M22 in Sagittarius. This again is photographed from Australia. I've actually gotten some decent ones from Algonquin Park, but it's very low in the sky, never gets above about 23 degrees from where we are, lower from where you are, but really, really nice. Here, a 200 millimeter view, and we really, and again, this is from Australia. You see the contrast, you see the different colors, you see the small Sagittarius star cloud. You see how blue that is compared with the yellow here, and the blue indicates very hot and very young stars. And these are, all very well-known objects. We see the Trifid Nebula here, the lagoon here, and so on. The Eagle Nebula, the Omega Nebula, and then this large open cluster of stars, M23. All of these are fairly familiar to Northern Hemisphere observers, but they're so much better viewed from the south. Another, just another view of that. And then, and so this is the small Sagittarius star cloud, and you really see the colors here as well. M24. This is one of the most unusual Messier objects because it's a star cloud, and it could not possibly have been mistaken for a comet, which of course was the whole purpose for which Charles Messier made his famous catalog. But and so it's never been really clear why this is part of the Messier catalog. Then going forward, we see, and this is shot with obviously the long focal length telescope, 1,253 millimeters long focal length, and this is the Omega Nebula in Sagittarius. And this one is actually further away, about 5,000 to 6,000 light years, about 40 light years across. The central cluster, open cluster here, is only about 1 million years old. This is really young. Then we get its neighbor, the Eagle Nebula. It's smaller, but you'll be familiar with this. And, I'm not going to pretend to be a Hubble or the Webb telescope, but from the original frame, these are the pillars of creation. So this is my version of that. And of course, it's one of probably the most famous Hubble photographs of all. And, this is my poor excuse, Michael Watson's take on it. Mine didn't cost as much. So there you go. But I really do. I like this very much as well. And then I do adore this, and I like this photograph. This actually was shot from Canada, from Algonquin Park, not the Southern Hemisphere. And what you really see here then is the Trifid, and of course Trifid, 3 tri, because of the 3 veins of dark gas. And that's why it's called that. And so that is the emission nebula part, and this is the reflection nebula part. Young, bright blue stars, giving off radiation, causing the gas to reflect the blue light. Now, one of the things that you can't see all that well or photograph all that well is the full extent of the lagoon nebula M8. And so you can start to see here, down here, that there is some more nebulosity, but it's tricky, it's elusive here. But from the Southern Hemisphere, if we turn the camera a little bit in orientation, from the southern hemisphere, this is what you get. And you really see that there is one heck of a lot more to the Lagoon Nebula than you can really see or photograph properly from the north. One of the reasons to go into the southern hemisphere. All right, and then we get into the tail of Scorpius here, M7, and we're starting now to get into an area that really is not well seen in the north, and we're going to go into the south a little bit. And we have here Antares with some, a lot of really interesting nebulosity. And this one, I should say, this one was also photographed from Algonquin Park. So you got to have a really, because it's so low in the sky, you got to have a really clear night to see this. So we get to the south, and I'll get through this in the next 10 minutes, promise not more than that. The stuff we can't see here. And so what the heck is all of this? Well, this is a 50mm view. And some of you who've been there will be able to pick out some of this stuff almost right away, but let me superimpose it. And so what we see here is Centaurus, Alpha and Beta Centauri. They're not actually known as that anymore, but Regal Centaurus and then Hadar. Then we have the famous Southern Cross, much smaller, very much smaller than the Northern Cross. And then the Coal Sack, which is really, really prominent when you're looking up at the southern Milky Way, against some more hydrogen gas clouds. And then what is probably my favorite object in the entire sky over here, the Eta Carina Nebula. I'll be showing you the last photograph of this whole show is that one. And I tried for a long time to get a decent photograph of that, taking progressively larger telescopes to the southern hemisphere before I could finally get one that I thought was, reasonably acceptable. And then this one, and this is really neat. You see this long, tenuous, dark gas cloud. That was named. It wasn't known. It wasn't known until Sky and Telescope's Dennis DeChico photographed it on a southern trip a couple of decades ago. He'd never seen it, and he looked at it and said, well, what the heck is this? And so he decided to call it the Dark Doodad, and that's its name. And I like that. I really like that a lot. So here we have the Southern Cross here, okay? And we can see the coal sack. Now the coal sack actually looks more prominent to the unaided eye, because here the long exposure with a really good telescope is capturing a lot of stars that you don't see there. It really does look naked eye like a black hole in the sky. And here's the galactic equator again, with a whole bunch of open clusters, and we tend to see these. The globular clusters are in the halo of the Milky Way. Open clusters tend to be in the center of the Milky Way. And we saw that in Cassiopeia, and we can see it here as well. Then this one is the brightest of all the globular clusters, 47 Tucani. Toucan, obviously the toucan, the bird. And a lot of you are going to be saying, whoa, wait a minute, Michael. No, that's not right. Omega Centauri is. Well, Omega Centauri actually isn't a globular cluster. Until about 10, 15 years ago, it was thought to be. You was going to see a photograph of it, but it's actually considered now to be the remnant of a dwarf galaxy, not a globular cluster, although it looks very similar to that. So this is 47 Tucani. Obviously can't see it from the northern hemisphere. Shot from the southern hemisphere. Believe it or not, this is a series of 30-second exposures. And here we see then the Small Magellanic Cloud. This is with a 200mm lens. And this is where 47 Tucani is with respect to the Small Magellanic Cloud. So it's right next to it, and it's really, really pretty, I can tell you. And here then is Omega Centauri. This is a photograph I wanted to get 3 years ago, last time anybody was traveling in September 2019. I really wanted to get this, and I'm fairly happy with this. It's very concentrated, and so it's difficult to be able to show the outer reaches of it as well as the inner portion without sort of burning it in. But I think I managed to do an okay job on this, and it's just one of the great showpieces of the sky. There are many, many hydrogen gas clouds. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this then is my favorite, and that's the Eta Carinae Nebula. and it's one of the showpieces of the southern sky. It's also one of the most interesting stars. Eta Carinae itself is right here. It has one of the most unusual histories in the, it was for a long time way below naked eye visibility. Then it was an explosive nova that for a time in the 1800s became the second brightest star in the sky. And then up and down and up and down, it's gradually faded down back down to sixth magnitude. But this really is just one of, I think, one of the great showpieces of the entire Milky Way. And so, there you go. It is, this is how I always like to finish this show. And well, actually, not quite finish the show. Then this last one, and I will tell you that you may have seen this. It was the centerfold photograph in an issue of Sky News, 3 years ago, I guess. This view has never before been photographed. And what I mean by that is that this is the center of the Milky Way Galaxy. And what you have on one side, this is a photograph I wanted to get for years because I knew it was coming. Jupiter on one side of the center of the Milky Way and Saturn on the other. And that's never happened since the invention of photography. And so this was the first time and only time in our lifetimes for hundreds of years when this is going to happen, that you get those two bright planets on either side. And so I'm going to then finish up then quickly with the Magellanic Clouds. We see the small one and the large Magellanic Cloud, and you can see where they are with respect to the Milky Way, 200 millimeter lens view. And this is the famous Tarantula Nebula there. This is the small Magellanic Cloud close up. And the large one, and here, this was also one that I waited a long time to photograph with the Tarantula Nebula, and lots of hydrogen gas clouds and open star clusters. And so this is how I will finish. And I'll just say that, when you can get into a dark sky in the summer here, or in the winter or fall in the Southern Hemisphere, just remember that, this is our home. There's no place like it. And I will thank you very much. That is my presentation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michael. That was absolutely fabulous. The guy that named the dark doodad, Dennis, what was his last name?
Dennis DeCicco. Dennis
DeCicco
is also the one at Sky Telescope who did, over the course of a year, the famous photograph of the Analemma.
Oh yeah.
Remember that? Storied publisher and astronomer. Yeah.
So that particular dark nebula isn't in any catalog at all?
I've never seen it in any catalog, and I've got a whole bunch of them here that I use to label them, and so no. I like it because it's a really technical name.
Absolutely.
So,
well,
Michael,
thanks.
I have a question. Several times, well, quite often actually, you would refer to the 200 millimeter or 50, or I think there was even when you said 14.
Yeah.
And okay, so this shows my ignorance of astrophotography, but what were you referring to? I mean,
okay, sorry, I should have made that a little bit clearer. Those are simply ordinary lenses, camera lenses on my DSLR. And so a 14 millimeter is a super wide angle lens, and these are all, a 50 millimeter is a standard lens, 200 millimeters is a kind of a sort of mid-level telephoto lens, and I use those a lot. Yeah, I photograph through the telescope, but I use those camera lenses an awful lot because, as I say, and as you can see, you get great wide-angle views. And so this one, for example, this is the one behind me here is a 24 millimeter lens, and you can see then the Magellanic Clouds. You see the Milky Way setting in the Australian outback. My God, you don't need. Well, my two big telescopes cost about $10,000 each. You don't need that. You don't need that at all. You know, if you've got a decent, you know, little mount, even a $500 star tracking mount with a decent DSLR and a 50mm lens, you can take quite decent photographs. You really absolutely can. And you know, so I don't want people to think, yeah, I've been at this a long time, and you know, you see, and the equipment looks kind of fancy. But you know, diligence and getting out into a dark sky, that's the key to it. With modest equipment like that will really reward you, I'll say, Bruce.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think I've gone on far too long. It's 11 o'clock here in the East. I have to hop on a plane to do run a seminar in Ottawa tomorrow morning. So I think I'm going to have to say goodnight to everybody there. And simply, again, thank you very much for inviting me.